everyone. Welcome to our series, which marks the 143rd anniversary of the first Girmitiers arriving in Fiji. In this series, we will hear from renowned Girmit historians and creative artists. In this episode, we will be hearing from Professor Goolam Vahed on South Africa's Girmit history. Goolam Vahed is a professor in the Department of History at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He completed his undergraduate research at the University of Durban-Westville and his master's and doctoral degrees at Indiana University, Bloomington in the USA. His research interests include identity formation, citizenship, ethnicity, Islam, and transnationalism among Indian South Africans. He's also interested in sports and transformation in South African society. His most recent books include A History of the Present, a biography of Indian South Africans from 1994 to 2019, and this was published with Oxford in 2019. Another book is Color, Class and Community, which looks at Natal Indian Congress between 1971 and 1994, and that was published with Wits in 2021. Professor Vahed has presented at conferences in many parts of the world, and he regards his visit to Fiji in 2017 as one of the highlights of his life. The visit to the shipwrecked Syria was a particularly moving experience, especially the warmth and hospitality of the local people. Professor Bridge V. Lal, who passed away on Christmas Day 2021, was an important mentor in Professor Vahed's own work on Indentured. Let us now hear from Professor Goolam Vahed.
My name is Goolam Vahed, and I'm teaching the Department of History at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And today I will do a short presentation on Indian indenture in South Africa and its aftermath, taking the journey up to the present. This will be a largely photographic journey so as to maintain your interests. And so Natal was one of the later colonies to receive indentured labor. It was earlier than Fiji, but the whites settled here from the 1820s. The British annexed the land in 1843, and then the settlers who arrived did very well with sugar, but the problem was labor because the indigenous Zulu were not prepared to work on the terms and conditions set by the settlers. And so the solution, some of the planters had experience of Mauritius, and so they decided to request labor from India. And after lengthy negotiations, the first indentured arrived in November 1860, and the system continued for half a century, by which time over 152,000 indentured workers arrived when the system was finally stopped in 1911. One remarkable feature is that around 60% of the workers were employed on the sugar plantation, but others worked on the railways, they worked for the municipalities, and they worked for private individuals as domestic helpers. And one of the also occupations that became associated with Indians was actually being a waiter in hotels, and that's something that they dominated. The indentured migrants were followed shortly after by what came to be known as passenger migrants, because these were individuals who paid their own fare to Natal, and they would be quite influential politically as well. Women constituted a very small segment of the population. It was hoped that they would make up 40% of the migrant population, but in the end, it was just around 28% of indentured workers who came. And a lot of them were single women who came with single, but often accompanied by children. So these are just some 19th century photographs of women. So the colonial authorities had hoped that Indians would return to India had feared that they would return to India after 5 years. So they actually insisted that they had to spend an additional 5 years in the colony in order to qualify for a free passage home. But most Indians did not re-indenture. Instead, they took to market gardening and came to dominate that trade, in Durban and all the major cities. So soon the Indian population was larger than that of the white settlers. And from the 1890s, the local politicians made at least 3 representations to the British government to end indenture in India. But they, in other words, as soon as the 5 years were up, the migrants had to return to India, but the British government refused that. So most Indians then settled in Natal. But as you can see from here, very soon, within decades, by the 1880s, you had football clubs, cricket clubs, musical clubs, and education became important. Most of it was mission funded. But here you have a photograph of a Natal Indian Teachers Society by 1903. And the other picture is of Swami Shankaranan, who was a very important figure who came to Natal in 1908 and spent about 5 years here. And he helped to organize Hindu young men's societies throughout the colony. Now, this is a very interesting tournament, which was Sam China arrived here, he's pictured there with his family, arrived as an indentured migrant in the 1860s. He moved to Kimberley, which was a mining town, after completing his indenture, accumulated a lot of wealth. And here he had this trophy made in London in 1903. And he organized what was called a Sam China tournament. And Indian provincial teams from throughout the country participated against each other. And this tournament was held every 2 years. And he made it clear that the purpose of his tournament was to unite Indians throughout the country. Religion, as you can see from the earliest days, is provided a sense of community. It provided a means by which the migrants settled themselves in the new colony. And you had the Muharram festival, which people from all religious backgrounds participated. Hindus had their temples and, they dressed up for many festivals. So it was a very vibrant community. Now, the one figure who played a crucial role would be Gandhi. As I mentioned, when the British settlers could not, force the Indians to return to India, what they did was they passed a series of laws so that Indians were restricted in terms of where they could stay, where they could trade. They also passed a law preventing them from voting. They stopped further Indian free immigration. And they also imposed a £3 tax on anybody who was not indentured. Now, most people could not afford this. So the purpose was very simply to force Indians to continue to re-indenture. So after this law came into effect, it was introduced in 1897, but probably came in 3 or 4 years later. Once it was introduced, the number of Indians who were re-indenturing increased quite dramatically. Now, Indians had a series of grievances, and a crucial role, of course, was played by Mohandas Gandhi, later the Mahatma Gandhi, who rallied Indians around the idea of satyagraha or passive resistance. But a very powerful figure was Gokhale, the moderate Indian nationalist leader who toured in 1912. And as you can see, he drew thousands and thousands of supporters on his tour throughout the country, and this created a sense of Indian, identity. And when he left, he gave the impression that the government had told him that they were going to do away with the tax. And so people expected the repeal of the tax. And actually that did not happen. The government insisted that it gave no such promise. And so Gandhi organized a strike in 1913, which involved all the workers on the railways, the the coal mines, the sugar plantations, they brought the Natal economy to a standstill. And in some places, it became very violent. And here's one of the women who's a widow. Her husband was shot dead on a plantation. But anyway, the negative international publicity of this meant that the British government pressured the South African government to come to come to some agreement, and it became known as the Smuts-Gandhi Agreement, which brought to an end, which did sort of repeal the tax. But Indians, by and large, remained second-class citizens. They could not. There was no further immigration. There were restrictions on where they could live and trade as well. So the period from the 1920s to the 1940s sees Indians very rapidly move away from the plantations. So that's another unique feature, probably, in comparison to other colonies where Indians did not remain on the farm, but they very quickly came to constitute an urban working class. And every now and then, the links to India remained quite strong, and this was reinforced by the visits of powerful leaders. One of them was Sarojini Naidu, who visited in 1924. And she was appointed president of the South African Indian Congress, the first woman and only woman to hold that position. But this helped to keep the ties to India alive. And so as the legislation, anti-Indian legislation intensified, South African Indians turned to India for help. And so the Indians sent what was called a delegation, and they had discussions. It came to be known as the Round Table Conference in 1927. And, people like C.F. Andrews and Sarojini Naidu were part of that delegation. And they came up to some agreement. Basically, the government, two things happened. The government agreed that it would improve the rights of all Indians who were in South Africa. They called it the uplift. And at the same time, the Indian government appointed an Indian agent general. So these agent generals were appointed to be in South Africa to be sort of the go-between the Indian community and the South African government. And they, tried to smooth relations. So most of them were very high-profile individuals. And one interesting figure was Sir Raza Ali, who married a local Hindu woman by the name of Miss Punu Sami. And that really upset the Indian community, the Hindu community. And in fact, for a couple of years, the Natal Indian Congress was split as the Hindu members left, but eventually the differences were resolved. But it just, it was an interesting period. But the 1930s now is marked by, we call that earlier leadership a moderate leadership, but people like Dr. Goolam and Dr. Monty Naika, who studied at Edinburgh, they became doctors. And these professionals, together with the massive urban working class, they took control of the Natal Indian Congress in 1945, and they launched a passive resistance campaign for 2 years from 1946 to 1948. 1948, of course, was marked by a very sad occasion, which was the death of Gandhi, and you can see his importance to South Africa because his son, Manilal, and even now his granddaughter, Ella Gandhi, there's a very, important presence in South Africa. So Gandhi's great-granddaughter, Uma Dupilia Mestri, is actually just retired as a professor of history at the University of Western Cape. And but shortly after this, you had the race riots of 1949, where there were 3 days of rioting that resulted in several hundred people dying, and thousands upon thousands of people were left homeless. And that to this day, left a mark on the consciousness of Indians. But following this, the Natal Indian Congress then decided that they would like to patch up these differences and try and forge a non-racial alliance. And they took part with the ANC and the coloreds and the whites. And they had the Defiance campaign in 1952. The Freedom Charter was adopted in 1955. A lot of activists, 156, were then arrested and underwent a 5-year a treason trial, but nobody could be found guilty at the end of it. But all this, forged closer relations between Indians and Africans and coloreds and whites. But the 1960s, then you find that the state now becomes very powerful. And so people have, leaders like Mac Maharaj in the middle is first up on the right-hand side. On the top is Phyllis Naidu, in the bottom is MP Naika. But these people were either banned in the house, meaning that they couldn't go out, they had to just stay in the house. Some were imprisoned on Robben Island and others went into exile. But the condition of the Indian community then changes rapidly in the 1960s. You had what was called group areas, which meant that Indians were moved to specifically Indian areas. So they only lived amongst Indians and attended Indian schools, Indian hospitals, Indian universities. And so the sense of Indianness became very powerful. But, the most affected group in Natal were the Indians by the Group Areas Act. You can see they had to leave the places where they had lived for decades, and they were just shunted into townships. So, but, this apartheid was also like a double-edged sword. It had good, and I wouldn't say good, I'm sorry, that's the wrong word, but it had certain material benefits. So you had the growth of Indian schools, you had the ML Sultan Technikon, which was actually funded by an indentured migrant who left a substantial portion of his estate for education. You had an Indian university. And so all of this led to the emergence of a professional class and upward economic mobility. At the same time, Indians were now moving into different occupations, nursing, secretarial work, postmen, police, hairdressing, all kinds of work. And so the daily lives, you find that even leisure time activities began to change. Music scene was quite vibrant. Fishing remained the second most popular activity amongst Indians after soccer. And the annual, Easter, day at the beach was very popular, Easter Monday, and the women would be involved in a tug of war. So these were all community efforts. We had a vibrant, what you call an Indian theater, Indic theater, it came to be known as. And in the 1970s, much of it was what we call protest theater. Religion also remained vibrant. Two things that I can point to as big trends. One was a very large conversion to Christianity, Pentecostal Christianity, particularly among South Indian Hindus. So that now, today, a third of all Indians in South Africa are Christian, whereas originally they were only 2%. But amongst Hindus and Muslims, you also had the emergence of reformist tendencies. Then sport, and this is one of the greatest golfers, Indian golfers by the name of Papa Sugalam. And he, in fact, beat one of the all-time great golfers, Gary Player, at a tournament in Durban. And because he was Indian, he could not collect his prize, and he had to stand outside the clubhouse in rain to collect his prize. So the government now, in providing all of these facilities, it also provided alternative sort of bodies within its structures for Indians to use. So these are some of the politicians who are involved in that. But as you can see from the disappointed face, very few Indians participated in that. And in fact, the 1980s then would see, the emergence of the Black consciousness movement, a very powerful workers' movement. The Natal Indian Congress becomes revived, and you have the UDF, United Democratic Front, which then again carries the revives politics in the country, and they eventually make the country ungovernable, not only militarily, but also economically unviable. And so in 1994, we have our first democratic elections. That's Ahmed Kathrada on the top, who with Nelson Mandela was imprisoned on Robben Island. In the middle is one of our great women activists, Fatima Mir, seated with Nelson Mandela. And as you can see, they've tried to get Indians to vote by using the name of Gandhi. And that's our first, in the middle there is in a green sari is Frene Jinwala, who was the first speaker of parliament. So, but the post-apartheid period would then see ongoing struggles over service delivery because the working class, the policies adopted by the government were not favorable to workers. So you had service delivery protests, you had the what was known as the Indian market. Suddenly they wanted to turn it into a shopping mall, so that became a major struggle. Then you had new migrants coming in from South Asia, and as you can see, most of them dominate the chicken tikka business, the hairdressing business, and you know, they love their cricket as well. New connections with India are also taking place. The Miss India South Africa, our president, but some of it is negative because you had this Indian family called the Guptas who are associated with state corruption, and so that breeds a lot of negativity. And in 1860, then, in 1910, we had a 150-year commemoration, and it was really on a massive scale. And that's a photograph there of the great E.S. Reddy, who was based at the United Nations and did a great deal for anti-apartheid movement, receiving a prize and honor from Ella Gandhi, the great-granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi. And so I'll end with July 2021, where there were, looting and riots, and it just shows you that race has not died. The issue of race remains very strong, because when the Indians in Phoenix were defending their area, then it became a very racialized affair, and all over the country, Indians were again branded as being racist. And so this whole issue of what was looting became a race issue. So race tensions, unfortunately, have not simmered. And in fact, as much as we like to call ourselves a non-racial democracy, race issues remain at the forefront of the problems, together with poverty that we have. And so finally, I would like to thank Radio and Television Apna for this opportunity to give this short presentation. And I would also like to wish the people of Fiji the very best for the 143rd Fiji Gilmet Remembrance Day commemoration. Thank you.